Tag. Bonjour. Hello. Welcome to this third conversation between the National German Library and Library and Archives Canada. My name is Francesco Manganiello, and I will be your moderator for this discussion. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you on the traditional, unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I'm aware that we're all living and working on different Indigenous territories and homelands, and I invite you to take the time to think of where you work and play and the privilege that we all have in living on those lands. Thank you. In today's discussion, we will explore web archives as a first draft of the present. Our guest speakers will share their experience on web harvesting and preservation, as well as the challenges constantly changing technological changes on how content is consumed over the internet. So we have two guest speakers who are joining me today for this conversation on web archiving and web preservation. From the German National Library, we have Dr. Britta, Woldering, web archiving expert. And from Library and Archives Canada, we have Roslynn, who is the the Director for Digital Preservation and Migration. Welcome to you both, Britta and Roslynn. So now I'd like to pass the mic to Roslynn to sort of introduce us to this panel discussion today. Roslynn.
Perfect, thanks, Francesco. Before we get started, I thought we could spend a bit of time talking about the background of web preservation and really to understand that, a bit the background of the internet. So when we think about it, the internet is really all about communication and sharing information. How we manage and capture that information we share is important. Let's take an example, the Canadian Diplomatic Corps. I spent a lot of my career at Global Affairs Canada, which is our foreign office. And a large part of diplomacy is communication back and forth to headquarters from our embassies and missions abroad. Let's think about that in context of time. An ambassador today has an instant connection with Ottawa. They can have contact even in a catastrophic event. There's options for communication. Comparably, a diplomat right up into the late 19th or beginning of the 20th century would have relied on ships, which would take weeks or months to communicate back to headquarters. By the early 20s, there were commercial airlines delivering mail within Canada, but not internationally. Important messages could come by telegraph. The first transatlantic telephone cables were put in place in 1958. At that point, diplomatic cables were short, succinct messages, which really often required follow-up by diplomatic pouches, which contained the more fulsome information. In fact, in the 1970s, we had a team of diplomatic couriers traveling by commercial airplanes to deliver diplomatic pouches, and we called these people the communicators. In the 1960s, academic institutions and governments were continuing to evolve the way we could move data around the world. In just over 50 years, we've gone from diplomatic communications of the 70s to the World Wide Web and the Internet of Things that we all experience and enjoy today. The internet as we know it connects the world like never before, but it's fast moving. What's there today may be gone tomorrow. What's there this morning may be gone this afternoon. And this is where digital preservation of web assets comes into play. To take that down to a personal level, imagine your Instagram. If you're like me, I keep a lot of my cherished memories on my Instagram account. The photos that make the cut are usually my favorite photos that tell the most compelling story about what's going on in my life today. But I don't actually own that space. It's a service that I use free of charge. So I don't have control of when they delete things. I mean, they haven't yet. They're not likely to. I don't mean to pick on Instagram. There's obviously lots of vendors out there that we use websites and web applications all the time. But think about it from the context of preservation. If those photos are really important to me, do I have them saved somewhere else? Have I taken a screenshot of them? Have I preserved them, really? And I think if you're like most of us, you may have some questions there. I have one friend who all the photos of her last baby, her second child, aren't printed out. So she has a couple she's printed out. For the most part, they're just on Instagram or Facebook. And again, not picking on Instagram or Facebook. So I think that web preservation and the things that we see on the web today may not be there tomorrow. And we want to make sure that we're capturing at least a snapshot of what's going on the internet, because it is such an important communications tool for us.
Hey, thanks, Roslynn, so much for providing that really quick but expansive history on the rapid evolution of communication and information, and also bring it to the personal level. I think we can all relate, whether it's Instagram or any other social media events, and how the web impacts us. I'd like to welcome Britta from the German National Library to provide her sort of introduction to our discussion today.
Yes, so why should we archive the web? There is this saying, the web never forgets. On the other hand, websites are constantly changed, deleted, added, so it continuously forgets. What is forgotten and what stays on the web forever is beyond control. Nobody knows which version or part of a website continues to exist at another place, even if the original was changed or deleted. For this reason, it is important for a country to archive these parts of the web which are considered to be important as cultural heritage. We have an example in our web archive in the German National Library which shows how important web archiving is. In Germany, there was a German issue of the Financial Times Deutschland, and the publisher decided in 2012 that the newspaper as well as its online presence would be closed down. We heard about these plans and contacted them, and by joint efforts, we managed to crawl and archive the complete website, including the online archive, before it went offline. There are examples in other countries too. In 2013, the UK Conservative Party deleted more than a decade's political speeches from its website. Or 3 years later, in 2016, the BBC closed down its popular BBC food website, removing 11,000 recipes in the public domain. These are only a few examples from different aspects of life which show what we could miss if there was no web archiving. By the way, both British examples were rescued by the Internet Archive.
Thanks, Britta, again, for providing some pertinent examples that affect all our different aspects of life. And it's hard to imagine having something so close to our fingertips and all of a sudden disappear. So again, thank you so much for providing the context from the German National Library. I'd like to ask Roslynn if she could provide a little bit more information from Library and Archives Canada's experience with regards to web preservation.
Sure. So a bit of background on the web harvesting and web preservation program here at Library and Archives Canada. We have a very mature program. So we've been involved with the web archiving program since around 2003. I'll go into a few more details in terms of dates, but the web archiving program and social media as well involves a multidisciplinary team. So I have a team that's made up of digital archivists, digital librarians, and technical staff. And they work together with internal and external stakeholders to develop the LAC web archive. LAC collaborates with other memory institutions to preserve the historical web for current and future researchers as well. And we're aligned with international best practices and are an active and founding member of the International Internet Preservation Consortium, or the IIPC. In fact, in 2003, LAC, the Internet Archive, and 12 additional institutions founded that IIPC. In 2005, we had a Government of Canada Web Archive, GCWA, we like acronyms in the government, here at LAC, and that was using in-house hosted infrastructure, and we used an open source software called Heritrix. That established our web harvesting program, and we began to collect websites and assets. In 2007, we officially launched in the Azure cloud, where we remained until 2020. And the infrastructure to support the service was also hosted in-house. Between 2008 and 2013, we ceased most of our web harvesting operations as it was considered a discretionary service at that time. But by 2013, we had transitioned to a software as a service provided by the Internet Archive's Archivit. And this cloud-based software is used by LAC to perform web harvesting, collections curation, description, metadata management, and quality control. In total, we collect 13 terabytes a year in web and social media assets. None of these have been made available to the public, but we are working with the Internet Archive to build a Wayback Machine for LAC to replace the GCWA. And this will allow LAC staff to manage web archival indexing, snapshot management, public access, and search of the collection through an API, or an application programming interface. So that 13 terabytes a year is a really large number when you put it in context. So right now, the GC Web Archive in total is about 80 terabytes of data. So we have about half of that in federal departmental crawls of our different ministries, publications, web renewal initiative, etc. We also have non-federal content of a similar size, about 35 terabytes. And that includes things such as the First World War, the Olympics, Canada's 150th birthday celebrations, etc. And finally, we have a COVID-related collection, which we began in early 2020. And that's about 7 terabytes. Actually, it's a bit larger now. I'd say it's just over 10 terabytes today. But it's important to realize that even with this great technology and support that we have, the technology has its limits and imposes constraints. So we can't capture everything. So we currently contract that 13 terabytes of web and social media resources annually. We collect that, and we have access to the best technologies available for collecting and managing the web as documentary heritage. But despite this, there's many resources we cannot acquire for technical reasons, either bad design, proprietary, or back-end tech. This needs to influence our acquisitions and expectations. And it's a question of sustainability versus effort versus value. So with our limited resources, we've made a decision that material that cannot be preserved or made accessible is not acquired. So that's, in a nutshell, the background of what we're doing at Library and Archives Canada vis-a-vis our web and social media preservation program.
Thank you, Roslynn, for providing a great snapshot and overview of the context of Library and Archives Canada in terms of the multidisciplinary nature of sort of the content that you do collect, but also the ecosystem and sort of the restraints that we work within. So thank you so much, Roslynn. I'd like to turn back to Britta if she could expand a bit more on web harvesting activities at the German National Library.
Yes. We started web archiving at the German National Library in 2012. Our activities are based on the law regarding the German National Library, which comprises the task of collecting, cataloging, indexing, and archiving non-physical media works, which means online publications, and that includes websites. The collection mandate is the German web. What does that mean? The most obvious answer is the .de domain, but there's a lot of content related to Germany on other top-level domains like .com, .org, .eu, and others. The .de domain alone consists of about 17 million registered URLs, and the ones in the other domains are likely to be even more. National libraries in countries with smaller top-level domains do a complete crawl of their country code top-level domain once a year and gain a broad snapshot of almost everything what is there. For example, Austria, Denmark, or Luxembourg are doing this. We did an experimental crawl of the .de domain only once in 2014 to see how far we get. We discontinued at 120 terabyte and decided that these complete crawls are not the way forward for us and that we focus on selective harvesting. That means that librarians select the websites which should be archived intellectually. The content is selected by topic or institution, for example, federal institutions or cultural organizations, and the websites are crawled twice a year by default. A further selection criterion are events. Planned events like elections, sports events, or anniversaries, as well as unforeseen events like the corona pandemic or natural disasters or terror attacks like 9/11. For these events, a broad spectrum of websites is selected and crawled frequently, sometimes even daily. As we cannot archive everything on the web which is related to Germany, we have to select and make snapshots. Our guiding principle is an exemplary diversity, how we call it, of the German present on the web. That means that we try to collect a broad variety of websites and have a broad representation of society in our collection. For example, in our COVID-19 collection, we have websites with official statements by the government and health authorities, as well as news pages, neighborhood initiatives, or corona deniers. So how is web harvesting done at our library? We are working with a service provider for this. The web archivists use a special tool to insert the selected URLs, a few metadata, and use that tool to adjust the crawling parameters, for example, how frequently the website should be crawled. Our service provider then use their own crawlers to harvest the web pages. They check the quality and store the data on their own servers. The metadata of the archive websites are integrated in the catalog of the German National Library automatically. So the users can access the web archive either via a catalog search or a search via an interface to the web archive directly. However, access to the web archive is only possible in the reading rooms of the German National Library and a few partner libraries because of copyright restrictions. And finally, the long-term preservation of the web archive is done in a separate repository at our library premises.
Thank you, Britta, for providing your experience to the German National Library. A lot of similarities with what Roslynn was saying in terms of just the expansive and the volume of information, but also the need to be aware of sort of the ever-changing topics and discussion of interest. Both you and Roslynn, during today's discussion on web archives as a first draft of the present, I think you've more than hinted at the challenges that both respective national institutions are facing in curating web archives that will be relevant and accessible and meaningful for future users and future researchers. So I'd like to go back to Britta, if she could maybe expand a little bit more on the German National Library approach with web archiving in light of some of the current events and topics that the institution would like to preserve for future users and researchers.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is really a challenge, as potentially everything might be of interest for future researchers, even things that we consider today to be trivial. So topics or events that are in the news can become topics to be collected. Trending topics in the social media can be an indication for something worth to be collected. It is very much a matter of experience of the web archivists to decide on this. As I said before, we at the German National Library have the principle of exemplary diversity. So when we decide that something is a topic for us, we try to collect different aspects and views of it. We are about to draft a project where we will explore whether and how we can automatize the selection process, for example, by analyzing the online news or social media for trending topics. I think for this, it is important not only to take the established daily newspapers as a basis, but also a broad spectrum of magazines of all kinds. It is not only politics or economy which represent the German present, but also trends in culture, in fashion, sports, or lifestyle. So as I said, trending topics in social media can be an indicator for something worth to be collected, but as a constituent element of social media is to fortify emerging excitement, we have to be cautious what we analyze, a real trend or functionality of social media. We will try to figure that out in our project. It would be a great step forward if we manage to partly automatize the selection for our web archive and find a way to collect a good representation of the German present on the web.
Yes, thanks, Britta. I find the approach really interesting that, of course, it all comes down to the selection criteria and to reflect the diversity in terms of not only German society, but society writ large. And you'll have to come back and talk to us, let us know how that goes in terms of automatizing that process. Roslynn, I was wondering if you can expand a bit more on what Library and Archives Canada is doing with regards to web preservation and web archiving.
Sure. I thought what might be interesting is to take a deeper dive on one of the collections, which is quite pertinent to us right now, and that's the COVID collection. So in February 2020, we started to actively collect web assets related to the coronavirus or COVID-19. And 18 months later, we have a fairly fulsome collection. As I said, in February 2020, we began by selecting COVID-19 related websites and social media for preservation. We've been archiving relevant content every day since. Some 18 months have gone by since the project began, and that gives us a long perspective on the project and an opportunity to reflect on the work we have done and continue to do as an institution. In the early days of our curation, we identified several subject categories that we considered high priority for web archiving. These subject categories capture both the response to the crisis from public health agencies, governments, charities, and other groups, as well as the impact of the pandemic on life in Canada. Our subject list continues to grow as the situation with COVID-19 evolves. So, to go through some of those subject areas, it might be of interest to you as part of our curation decisions. So, business and the economy. So, this includes resources which document the impact of COVID-19 on Canada's business and economic sectors. It includes corporate and small business websites, information about foreclosure threats and industry efforts to prevent foreclosures, labor union impact and activity related to COVID, and the actions taken by associations, individuals, governing bodies, as well as First Nation response to the COVID-19 pandemic across Canada. There's about 191 seed URLs in that portion of the collection. Of course, it wouldn't be complete without a harvest of the daily news media. So we've done a total of 34 news and media websites, which we crawl daily for COVID content. We've preserved thousands of articles from these 34 sources, and they include media and news websites in both official languages as well as in our Indigenous communities. From a federal, provincial, and territorial government perspective, of course, we wanted to keep an eye on the information the government was sharing, centered on public health, restrictions, closures, government services during COVID, as well as pandemic-related programs. We also took a look at religion and the impact of COVID on religious communities, their observances and worship, the shift to remote Zoom services, new forms of outreach, etc. Another collection was the families and education. So what were school boards saying regarding class cancellations and remote learning at home, with resources for parents and children, websites for organizations devoted to the well-being of children and youth, and associated content. Another item of interest was arts and culture, chronically the impact of COVID-19 on artists, performers, museums, galleries, and documenting the emergence of online exhibitions and remote performances. We also took a look at charities and nonprofits, sport. Of particular interest, you will all remember that the Olympics were postponed by a year. The Olympics is generally a collection that we capture for our web archive. So we had captured a lot of information around that switchover. I couldn't go without looking at some of the health science and academic information, what was going on in the academic research and medical communities. From a social media perspective, we looked at specific hashtags, COVID in Canada, COVID-19 Canada, Canada lockdown. There's a lot of tweets that we were capturing. And in fact, to date, we've captured over 1 million tweets. Sorry. Yes, actually, just around 1 million tweets. More recently, in 2021, we've been looking at regional and municipal public health and the vaccine rollout, as well as vaccine hunting, and documenting community efforts to help Canadians to find vaccines. There are also some social issues which came up during COVID, and we tried to capture those as well. They would include sort of Black Lives Matter, Indigenous Lives Matter, and anti-Asian racism. We tried to have good coverage, and that's where this multidisciplinary team is so important, by having librarians, archivists, and technical people working together to help to determine what our collection would look like. We have a very fulsome collection. And this also was an opportunity for my team to really show what their program was capable of doing. And yeah, so that's what we're doing here on one specific collection, and we have several others.
No, thanks, Roslynn. I mean, talking about the selection criteria and all the various topics of how this pandemic has impacted, amplified, or touched is really reflective of the day-to-day that we're all experiencing. And thank you for bringing the sort of the human approach with regards to how that could impact and affect our web preservation archive professionals and documenting something so expansive and unprecedented, such as a corona pandemic. And obviously, we wouldn't be here today in this format if it wasn't for the pandemic. And we cannot talk about, not talk about how this global event has impacted or disrupted our national institutions in terms of finding alternative solutions, bringing forth potential opportunities or unforeseen challenges. And I'm wondering, Britta, if from the German National Library perspective, if you could talk a bit about how this pandemic has disrupted or impacted your work.
Well, to be honest, the pandemic did not disrupt, well, at least our web archiving activities, as they are done online, and that was not a problem even during the pandemic. But one could argue that in a situation like the pandemic, library users should get remote access to the digital holdings of the library, but with only a few exceptions. For example, the Internet Archive in the US, access to web archives is restricted to the reading rooms in the national libraries, and the pandemic did not change this, unfortunately. This is not easy to convey to users, that the archive version of what was online and accessible worldwide is restricted to local use. It has to do with copyright legislation and is not something that can be changed easily by the libraries themselves. I would like to give an example. If a website owner puts stock photos on his website, he has to decide on how long they will be online and has to pay a fee for that, a license for copyrighted material. When such a website is being archived, the photos are used for this snapshot, so to say, forever, and not only for a few months, which they have been paid for. This is a copyright issue which is met by the law, allowing a few libraries and archives to make a copy of websites containing copyrighted material and to archive it. The compromise, if you will, is then that the website is not put online for use worldwide, but with restricted access only in the reading rooms. And as I said, unfortunately, the pandemic did not change that.
No, thanks, Britta, for providing the ecosystem and the framework within Germany and the German National Library. It's easy to forget that things existed before the pandemic, and perhaps even if the pandemic didn't change anything, it definitely may have amplified, the frameworks and the ecosystem that you're working in. And I know, Roslynn, you've already touched a bit about the collection, COVID collection in Library and Archives Canada and its impact. I'm wondering if you could provide a little bit more information on the impact or disruption of the pandemic on your work at Library and Archives Canada.
Yeah, I think that we were all in the same boat, in the same situation in the early days of the pandemic, just really adapting our personal and professional lives and looking at how we would work together in the future. It's so important to think of it in terms of, this has been a long 18 months. It's going to go a little bit longer, but we've found amazing new ways to work together, and that's amazing. I think our international partnerships and collaboration are critical to help us to keep. We've missed a lot of international conferences, just let's put it that way, and they've gone virtual, and that's been wonderful. It's actually opened up the opportunity to participate in conferences to more and more staff. So I think that though on a personal, professional level, there have been challenges, overall there have been great opportunities.
No, thanks, Roslynn. I mean, yes, it would have been nice to do this all in person, but thank goodness we can do this virtually. And it just is a testament, not just in terms of the flexibility, adaptability, but also the collaboration that existed long before the pandemic and maybe was fortified during this unprecedented global event. And I really think it's interesting too that on the personal level and on the institutional level, that analogy of that we're all in the same storm but in different boats applies quite rightly in terms of hearing both you and Britta talk about your professional experiences during this event. And hearing both of you speak today, you've reminded me of a quote from Marshall McLuhan that's probably more pertinent today than it was 40, 50 years ago, that we really become what we behold, that we shape our tools, and in essence, then our tools shape us. You've both elaborately have explained how the internet is an ever-evolving tool, and that today's media-rich content and social media platforms differ significantly over time, and the rapidity of these evolutionary changes is quite present, and you both have made those points. And there will always be financial incapacity or technological pressures associated with trying to capture what is significant and relevant for the internet for future generations of users and researchers to consult. But it's evident hearing you both that both our national institutions and other national institutions will have no choice but to somehow find ways to keep up with these rapid changes and communication trends. And the idea of international collaboration is one example of that. And so I'm thinking, this might be a bit of an unfair question, but if we could, look in the future, 20, 50, 100 years from now, and if you had a crystal ball, Britta, in your possession, I was wondering if you could explain or sort of provide some insight in how do you foresee sort of the future work with regards to web archiving and preservation, and who are our future users and researchers with regards to the content you're trying to preserve?
Well, I think it's really hard to foresee what the web will be like even in 5 years, not to speak about 20 or 50 years. What we see is that the original idea of the web to be freely accessible to all is being changed. More and more content is moving into apps, which are kind of walled gardens. For example, before the rise of social media, small enterprises, restaurants, clubs, organizations had their own small websites. Since setting up an account on social media and have an online presence there is much easier than to compose a website, much of this kind of content drifted there. From a web archiving point of view, this is a setback as social media is hard to access and archive. And I think that this development, that the web is segmented into walled gardens with rules and regulations of private companies, will go on. A constant task for cultural heritage institutions will be to evaluate and decide which content on the web can be considered as cultural heritage and which parts are something else. And I think the sheer mass will continue to be an issue and even explode more. So selection criteria will continue to be a key issue.
No, thanks, Britta. That's consistent with what you've been saying all along, that the importance of that selection criteria. But I think what is interesting is the importance of that, that process will not be static nor linear, just like society itself. And there will be constant evaluation and reevaluation to ensure that the institution is relevant, but also in terms of trying to capture what is relevant for future users. So thank you for that. And Roslynn, if you had a crystal ball in your possession at Library and Archives Canada, I was wondering if you could sort of give your insights in terms of the future of the web and future users as well.
Yeah, sure, certainly. It's interesting that you chose a Marshall McLuhan quote, because I myself have also been thinking about Marshall McLuhan. The quote I'm thinking of his is, "The medium is the message." In this case, I really think that the data is the important piece. So back in 2011, I was attending a conference and we were talking about mobile device management. It was early days of tablet technology. And we were trying to figure out how we would secure the data on those devices. One of the things we talked about was the mobile device management. And at that point, I had an aha moment and I realized, no, it's a mobile data management question more than a device management. The device is just the thing that the data is showing up on, and that's going to be transient and change. The data itself is important. But then when you think about it, the interpretation of the data is less important than the actual data, because our interpretation of the data today is in our context today, but the researchers of the future are going to be looking at this data with their own interpretation. So Britta's absolutely right. We can't capture it all. The volumes and the pace of change just really, really impact our ability and capability to preserve everything. So what we need to do is we need to look at those most important things, those most cherished things. So in a world that's so fast-paced, we're going to have to make more and more difficult decisions. Mind you, the technology is going to get probably better and better at helping to support our work. I will say, though, in passing, that if I had a crystal ball, I don't think I could even see 2 years out. These walled gardens do exist, and we can't capture the information behind those walls. But the internet itself, the mobile devices, like the person of the future seeing us all wander around on our iPhones or our Blackberries, our mobile devices, they're not going to know what we were doing. It's going to look as strange to them as it looks for us today to look back at our ancestors from the 1950s, which is not that long ago in the grand scheme of things. And they wore poodle skirts, so a big puffy skirt with a poodle on it. So I think that probably 50 years from now, people will look at us carrying around our devices and think, what were they doing? So I think that all we can do is continue to be agile, collaborate, and figure out the best path forward as it arises, and make sure that there's something captured of this really special period of time, so that if people in the future are curious, they'll have something to look back to.
No, thanks, Roslynn. I like that poodle skirt reference, because if someone who's watching this doesn't understand, they can quickly go on their device and find out what that is. But hearing both you and Britta talk about the future in terms of, it's again the constant themes of the rapidity of change in terms of not just in terms of what is being produced, but also consumed, the what and the how. And I think hearing both you and Britta talk about we can't. There's that incapability of actually capturing everything. So then what do we choose to capture that's relevant, not just today, but also for future users and researchers is relevant. And I think the key words you've all used is adaptability, flexibility, and constantly revisiting not just the tools that we're using, but the criteria in terms of the how we're doing it. I think that's very pertinent in terms of not what we're doing today, but going forward. So I'd like to thank our guests, Roslynn Ross from Library and Archives Canada, and Dr. Britta Woldering from the German National Library. I hope we don't wait 50 years to do this again, virtually or in person, but I really thank you both for your time today to really provide the context in your respective institutions and countries, but also a lot of the similarities that we're facing together in terms of ensuring that pertinent information today is available and relevant for future users and researchers. I'd also like to thank my fellow colleagues at Library and Archives Canada behind the scenes who've made this possible, and also all of you today who've joined us from wherever you are on whatever device. Thank you for joining us today, and I'd like to wish you all a good day and to take care of yourself. So danke, thank you, merci, take good care. Ciao.